Sri Aurobindo is describing the release from the ego. In the practice so far outlined, we have gone through successive separation from the body, the life energy, the emotions, thoughts, and then the mind itself turns in a positive effort, in a constant fixing of the thought upon the idea of the one and infinite, even as there is a negative effort of denial of the reality of the ego. And through this process, through what we saw as a 5-step process, the consciousness awakens to the sense of the presence of the self, and from the mental realization deepens into a spiritual experience in the very substance of our being, and the various facets of that first contact and its deepening were described until eventually there is a constant giving up of the whole consciousness into the being of the Supreme. But at first, Sri Aurobindo points out, when there is still a restless confusion and an obscuring impurity in our outward nature, and the ego sense is still powerful, these experiences are not felt so easily. But gradually, as the instruments are purified and the consciousness in our nature becomes more and more pure, silent, clarified, and widened, it begins to reflect more and more directly the purity, infinity, stillness of the One, like the sky in a limpid lake. It's an image we read last time, but I want to dwell on this image of the limpid lake. As we saw last time, our consciousness, as it becomes clear and still and reflective, in other words, passive, but also clear and wide in its passivity, not a passivity of inertia, there is almost a spontaneous reflection of the higher things towards which it has turned in aspiration. So the state of aspiration, the state of stillness, clarity, widening and purity, all of these create the condition in which that which is above begins to reflect spontaneously, because it is always there, was always there, is always there, even when we are not conscious of it, even when our consciousness is like the muddied water of the little pond, agitated by the winds of our life energies, and therefore unable to reflect. But that always continues. When we create the right circumstances, then the reflection is automatic, spontaneous. And hence, the enormous importance given to our preparation and purification, and the rest becomes almost spontaneous. Especially when we relate to that consciousness not merely in passivity or in an aspiring consciousness reflecting, but when we relate to that consciousness equally with our heart's love, with our actions' consecration, and when we see that consciousness not only in its immutable, ethereal, impersonal vastness, but we know it also in its power of expression, in its power of divinity, of manifestation as the Divine Mother, then the relationship being intense, intimate, multifaceted in our being, the whole thing becomes almost an overwhelming experience where our call draws her response and her active intervention in preparing and purifying our condition, receptivity and so on, but also in actively establishing those higher ranges of consciousness in us. So it is not merely a purification and a readiness in which things reflect, but in the fullness of the integral yoga, this becomes also an active intervention from above that prepares, consolidates the purification and brings down the experiences, establishing them and transforming our nature. That part is not described here, but this is described in greater detail in the yoga of self-perfection, which is the formal framework of the integral yoga, which comes later and which we have seen before. But we must understand and appreciate what we are reading now with that in as the context and the backdrop. There is another interesting suggestion in the use of this word reflects. The one reflects itself like the sky in a limpid lake. When Sri Aurobindo uses the word limpid, we need to go deeper to see its sense. In its most obvious sense, which is the common use, there are three facets to the meaning: clear, transparent as water, crystal or air. That is the first meaning. Second, free from obscurity, lucid. And third, completely calm, without distress or worry, especially as it relates to emotions. Now you'll see something common in all three, but all three have a distinct facet which are all included in the condition described in our preparation. But it's not enough. We must go still deeper and see the origin of the word. And there we find something quite extraordinary from the Latin limpidus, which itself derives from Limpa, who is the water goddess. Goddess of water. In other words, the conscious divine presence embodying itself as fluid, clear waters. And suddenly it has a very deep Vedic resonance even. The state of our consciousness as limpid waters has to become like that. Clear, pure as the goddess of water, as the consciousness of the divine as it embodies in liquid stillness. Taking it in a very superficial sounding sense, we may say our human being, the body itself, is, as they say, 75% water or 80% water. But our life energies are described in the Upanishads as flowing waters. Even the mental consciousness has been described as a calm, still water in the Veda. And all of these suggest something, that the waters here, and especially when we relate to it in this deeper meaning, the waters here are the streams of consciousness which form the play of nature. And when these streams become quiet, then in the very substance of nature, on all these levels, there is the spontaneous reflection of the one in a limpid lake. And you see, this deeper meaning becomes obvious when we go to the most profound sense of the word limpid in its origin. And then, in the text we read last time, a meeting or a taking in of the reflected consciousness by that which reflects becomes more and more pressing and possible. The bridging or abolition of the atmospheric gulf between that and this becomes frequent, if not an entire permanent state. And why is this possible? even though we are not completely purified, for even before complete purification, if the strings of the egoistic heart and mind are already sufficiently frayed and loosened, the jiva can by a sudden snapping of the main cords escape, ascending like a bird freed into the spaces, or widening like a liberated flood into the one and infinite. These two, which also we read last time, need also some elaboration. These are two distinct movements in which the consciousness tends to rise and join with the oneness or the infinity above. There is a kind of a narrow movement where I am still this narrow, concentrated effort rising forward in a concentration. The image could be of a flame, or here in this case of a bird released, leaping up, and it rises into something which is vast, and it penetrates, rises high and high and high. And there's a very different movement where this consciousness, which was narrow, opens up right at the beginning, and as if the littleness being released from its narrowness widens out and merges into a wideness. And the whole movement is a widening movement of consciousness as it rises, merging into the vast. Both have their own value. Which of them takes place depends often on our temperament or in the movement at that moment. But eventually the two merge. Often there is a narrow rising movement which, as it goes high enough, breaks out into the wideness, and then there is a great descent of that wideness and calm. And as a result, the consciousness which is receiving itself loses boundaries and becomes wide. And there is this release which takes place. When this bridging takes place, and this is the text that we now continue from, when this bridging takes place, there is an opening of oneself into the universal, into the cosmic. This he now describes. There is first a sudden sense of a cosmic consciousness, a casting of oneself into the universal. So the first transition has a suddenness because it's as if all the barriers are gone and one experiences this enormity and this vastness. Suddenly the whole universe is there and you know it, you feel it, you're aware of it. From that universality one can aspire more easily, aspire to the transcendent. So here Sri Aurobindo is completing the sequence of the liberation, and then he goes back to a more detailed description. In the practice, at first there is this sense of wideness and universality. When that becomes more and more settled, from there an experience of the transcendent becomes possible, because we are also closer to it in this universality. From something which is small and finite, the transcendence cannot be felt, cannot be experienced, is even impossible to conceive of, except as a blankness. But from the universality, the transcendent is felt as if a breaking out even of the universality and its infinity into something which is beyond description. This passage he will describe later on, about two paragraphs later. So for now, he has just shown us the path ahead, and he moves to the description itself of this release. There is a pushing back and a rending or a rushing down of the walls that imprisoned our conscious being. So three variations in this experience. The walls which limited us, when we feel I am this person living in this body within this limited space, everything which is outside that is not I. This is the wall which defines our individuality, our ego sense. This wall is elastic. It varies even in the midst of our activities. If, for example, you are involved in work with a group of people, then if you are in charge, automatically this wall expands to include those people as people you are responsible for. They become for you as if extensions of your own ego, perhaps less narrow, perhaps less self-obsessed, but still it widens out. The ship captain experiences himself widened to meet the size and form of the ship. He must identify completely with the ship and all the people in it, because he alone is responsible for their lives. A car driver momentarily extends his consciousness to include the extension of the car. If you do not, you will find the person frequently scratches the bumper, scratches the edges, bumps into things, because it is not in his consciousness and he does not sense, therefore, the limits of the vehicle. In the midst of an activity, let's say you're working in a space which involves many different objects, in a construction space, in the carpentry, in a laboratory, your consciousness widens to include all those objects. Their arrangement, their placement is automatically a part of you. And there's a constant elastic narrowing and widening. If suddenly you find yourself in danger, instinctively the barrier shrinks, narrows, and becomes as if protective. You block out everything that's coming in from outside and cling to this very narrow, hardened border and outline of yourself. Once the danger passes, again the consciousness relaxes and becomes more fluid, the edges less distinct. So this borderline is as if pushed back, but rapidly widens out enormously. The mother recommends an exercise where she advises you to sit and let your consciousness widen in this way, consciously. Simply opening out. Become as wide as the room, become as wide as the town, become as wide as the whole earth, as wide as the whole universe. You could do it sitting in a room, you could do it lying down on a terrace. But this exercise of widening itself is like a preparatory exercise, prepares the consciousness to get habituated to being free of its narrowness and limitation. But it's also pretty much how it happens when this barrier is pushed back. Suddenly, though, it happens, and so suddenly there's a widening and the barrier just pushes back and you don't know where, it vanishes into the distance. Or rending is the second variation, where it gets torn. It's there, but the full impact of this enormity of the oneness and infinite tears it and it's gone. And you feel yourself released. Or third, pushing down of the walls that imprisoned. And in this case, the walls are still there, but your consciousness, as if a part of you in the higher parts especially, opens out. And so the feeling is, I am widening, and the walls which belong now to the lower ranges of my consciousness, they seem to be pushed down. This frequently happens when the opening first takes place in the mind, and from there it slowly settles into the lower parts. The ego in the mind is more flexible and freed, but the ego in the life force and body is still a little rigid, so you have the sense of the walls falling down. They are there and then they can pop up again. If they've been torn, they seem eventually as if to weave themselves back. If they've been pushed out, after a while when the experience passes, it feels as if they gently creep back and slowly one settles into something narrower, not as narrow as before, but still it comes. The walls are not so thick, not so dense, they become transparent. So these are three variations which he captures in this description. There is a pushing back and rending or a pushing down of the walls that imprisoned our conscious being. And as a result, there is a loss of all sense of individuality and personality. So now come, and then of all placement in space or time or action and law of nature. So these are two degrees in the experience. First side part is the loss of individuality and personality. You will recall that experience narrated by Sri Aurobindo when somebody asked him for the gift of silent mind. Sri Aurobindo asked him to sit down and went on reading the newspaper. Of course, his consciousness itself being living in that, he simply imprinted it on the man who was sitting there. And after a while, the man found his thoughts had stopped. The mind was silent. And he began to get extremely agitated, couldn't control himself. And finally, he jumped up and shouted, I'm going mad, and ran away. This sense of the loss of thinking mind, inability to think when he wants now to get back his normal sense of normal personality, was too much to bear. This similar thing happens when the individuality and personality fade out. Suddenly, where am I? Who am I? What am I doing? I can't get myself back. I'm as if losing. I'm as if losing myself, dissolving, flying off, breaking down. These are all variations of the experience in the vocabulary people use. If there has not been sufficient preparation, it can lead to a kind of a panic. And in the panic, one pulls back, calls back the walls and slams back the narrow ego sense. And at that point, something very strange happens. If you have done that, a part of your consciousness is still in the wideness. And so you feel yourself partly in some immensity, partly in this narrow wall that you have locked yourself in to protect, to be yourself. And suddenly you feel very small compared to this wideness. Because a part of you is experiencing the wideness, a part of you is in the smallness. And the contrast itself is extremely disturbing for someone not habituated. And you feel yourself very small. And you may begin to think that there's something wrong. And the mind or the emotions may get into a state of depression, thinking, oh, I'm so small, I'm so meaningless, I'm so helpless, my life is so useless, etc., etc. All the things associated with smallness. And one can even get into a whole condition of illness psychologically from that. But all of this would be automatic to a consciousness unprepared. And if suddenly there is this gift of a wideness given, in the practice of the yoga, one has already prepared oneself first in understanding, and then through a series of small experiences building gradually. Even at first, when first something touches of this, and there is a kind of a dislocation of the I-ness, of the personality, of the individuality, one finds oneself a little spaced out. So someone will say, I don't know who I was, I don't know where I was just in a daze and just wandering around mechanically. You have heard of such experiences from people who had a strong awakening when they first met the mother. Often the impact lasting 3 days. And then gradually things settle back. But during that time, I don't even know who I am. But what happens to the body and the machinery? It's going on doing mechanically, but I'm kind of lost. But actually it's not lost. The truth is you have found yourself, your wider self, your truer self, not yet the truest, but certainly truer. And that littleness was the false person. But because we have always associated ourselves with that littleness, when returning to it, we say, now I've come back to myself, I am now normal. It should be the reverse. And it's useful if we prepare ourselves for this. When there is a widening of any kind, however partial, however temporary, to recognize that as yourself. And the narrowness is the not you, or at best, a narrow projection of yourself. So, first, there is a loss of all sense of individuality and personality. And then from that, as that deepens, the second degree of it, of all placement in space or time or action and law of nature. So even the sequence is important here. Most often it is this sense of loss of space. Where am I? I don't know. Nowhere. I am not. I am actually not. I don't even know where I am. Because the sense of physical location exists when we are narrow in the wider space. When that narrowness, the barriers are gone, where am I? And there's a kind of a blur. But consequently, there is also a kind of a sense of loss of time. In that infinity, there is also the sense of eternity. And suddenly the past, present, future, and the sense of compelling, streaming, continuous movement of time has faded. There is only this immensity even in sense of time. Past, present, future is one continuous eternal, in which perhaps there is a movement, but in the immensity of that eternity, the movement itself seems irrelevant. And therefore, the sense of time itself, one loses placement in it. And in such a condition, where is action? What is action? So the sense of action or law of nature which binds, which compels, which keeps us going, all of that is faded out. So, we read the whole. And so as a result, there is no longer an ego, a person definite and definable, but only consciousness. You are aware, you are utterly aware, but the awareness has no boundaries, no location, no sense of space, time, form or action. It's just immense, vast awareness. Only consciousness, only existence, only peace and bliss. And this again describes degrees. At first, because you are experiencing it, you are aware. And there is an awareness of what is experiencing, or what is being experienced. And it is this borderless, formless awareness. But if you go deeper into it, the awareness has underlying behind it something which is sheer existing. Simply is. And the awareness itself is only like a surface part of its existence. Peace, therefore. And behind that, bliss. The bliss becomes more tangible when the foundation of peace and the oneness infinite has become established. In that condition, the bliss can be felt directly. Anything where there is not sufficient deepening of the oneness or infinity or the foundation of peace, the bliss cannot be felt. And we have discussed this before, but we can repeat. The bliss belongs to a consciousness which is not in duality, which is not in division. It can only be experienced in a consciousness of oneness which is infinite. No division, no opposition, no opposite. It's not exaggeration of pleasure or happiness, which have always opposites. So it has to be in a consciousness of oneness, existence of oneness, and itself is of a such intensity that it is overwhelming for the consciousness to bear, and therefore the foundation of peace. When any part in us is in movement or agitation, something immense hitting it will cause a disturbance. When the consciousness is absolutely still and founded in peace, then one can hold the entire ocean without getting agitated. And the peace itself, the bliss itself, is an oceanic peace which has waves, an intensity of waves which are infinite. Each wave is an infinity in the ocean of bliss, and therefore the foundation of peace. And that's why he has this sequence. And we reread the sentence. There is a pushing back and rending or pushing down of the walls that imprisoned our conscious being. There is a loss of all sense of individuality and personality, of all placement in space or time or action and law of nature. There is no longer an ego, a person, definite and definable, but only consciousness, only existence, only peace and bliss. One becomes immortality, becomes eternity, becomes infinity. And this is the final merging where there is no sense of separateness. It's no more a consciousness experiencing these things, it is consciousness which is immortality, eternity, infinity. So what happens in this experience when we are immortality, infinity, eternity? If from there we look back and say, oh, where is that ego personality? Where is that person that I used to know? So from there, when you turn your consciousness, there is no space-time limitation. So where are you? Immense everywhere. You are the infinite, eternal. Where is that consciousness which was there? Somewhere inside, but no location. You cannot say a distinct location, but somewhere in that. And this experience he describes. All that is left of the personal soul is a hymn of peace and freedom and bliss, vibrating somewhere in the eternal. Where you do not know, but it is there, and it is a hymn of peace and freedom and bliss, vibrating somewhere in the eternal. And the description captures all the facets of the experience. Hymn, why does he use the word hymn? Oh, you can say, oh, it's poetic imagery. No, it's not. It is the reality of it. In the ocean of the eternal, that little personality, individuality is like a vibration rising like a wave, but not separate from the ocean. But the vibration rising is a vibration of perfect harmony. But also because that harmony is founded in peace and bliss, it is a joyous movement. And the only equivalent we have in the human experience is this gently rising movement of harmonious music. For those of you who have attended Narad's Om choir, when you feel 20, 30, 50 people gently chanting Om, and the movement, multiple resonating voices, but in perfect harmony, the movement gently rising up. You have a sense of this. A hymn rising, but here it is the hymn of an individual, the individual itself having multiple fine threads, lines of facets of personality, movements of its energies. And so there is a harmony in that, and the hymn rising. All that is left of the personal soul is a hymn. But since it is founded in the peace and the freedom and the bliss, so it is a hymn of peace and freedom and bliss, vibrating. It is only like a gentle resonance somewhere in that immensity of the eternal, vibrating somewhere in the eternal. That's all that remains. From here, one could take it further. One could turn to something which is even beyond this. And this he will be describing 1.5 paragraphs later, where he discusses the soul may go even beyond this realization. It may either rise to the Brahman on the other side of all idea of self, as a void of everything that is here, into that indescribable, and against which what happens to this even the him and the eternal and the infinite, all these fade out. Against that, all this is even a dream, or even a dream is too substantial. Beyond the dream, the end of a dream. But that description and what it means and what is its truth in the context of the integral yoga, we will come to later. For now, we just point to that further possibility. This experience, though, is capital. A glimpse of it is generally what we first have. Not all will experience the bliss aspect. Not all will experience the merging in becoming eternity, becoming infinity, becoming immortality. Rather, at first, it is a reflection of these things. In the stilled consciousness, one feels this immensity which is present all around. Eternity, infinity. That immensity is immortality. We are as if turned to that, reflecting that, or as if soaking in that, or remaining immersed in that, or as if we've forgotten ourselves in the immersion in that, whatever variation it is. It's a degree from which all these degrees, as he describes, will eventually develop. But at first we have only something of this. And then it passes. If you're fortunate enough and have had a glimpse of something more concrete going all the way to this, even then it passes. And so Sri Aurobindo now describes this situation. The thing which bothers all those who take to the practice of any conscious spiritual life. You have an experience, and sometimes a wonderful experience, a profound experience, even a life-changing experience, but it has to end, it passes. If it is 3 days, after 3 days it fades out. If it is 3 hours, it still fades out. If it's 3 minutes, it still fades out. What to do about that? And afterwards you struggle to get it back, and you don't seem to get it easily. And this, the cause of this and the means to deal with this is now described. And this is such an important chapter, as such an important paragraph. Sri Aurobindo writes, when there is an insufficient purity in the mental being, the release appears at first to be partial and temporary. The jiva seems to descend again into the egoistic life, and the higher consciousness to be withdrawn from him. In reality, what happens is that a cloud or veil intervenes between the lower nature and the higher consciousness. And the Prakriti, nature, mechanical lower nature, and the Prakriti resumes for a time its old habit of working under the pressure, but not always with the knowledge or present memory of that high experience. So this is the reality of what has happened. Although the experience has faded for us, although it has gone to our awareness, and although there is this mechanical movement of our life which has resumed, the egoistic life has come back, but he says, it is under pressure of that high experience, but not always with the knowledge or the present memory of that. So the part now, I am here, I am back to my routine. Maybe a few days have passed or a few months have passed, the impact is now lost, forgotten. I am not conscious of that, or I am not conscious that its influence is on me. I do not even remember the experience. Now it has faded so much. I just remember there was this extraordinary thing, but I cannot even recall it. It has faded to that degree. Still, it is there, and its pressure is there on the lower Prakriti. But in between is the cloud or veil, which intervenes between the lower nature and the higher consciousness. Consider that right now, even before one has that experience, there is a cloud or veil. It is the removal of that cloud and veil which allows the reflection of the sky in the still waters. But afterwards the veil or the cloud come back. But once there has been this impact, there is its pressure always. And this is the reason why in the initial contact with the mother, she would give you the gift of an experience. Momentarily cutting through the cloud, parting the veil, something is imprinted and then it's left to you. But with your best effort, you cannot prevent the eventual return of the cloud and the veil. It comes back, the experience is gone. But the link having been made once, under its pressure, there is a change taking place. The most obvious form of that change is, I remember that and I yearn for it, I long for it, I wish I could have it again, I want to get it back. Just that is what we would say is the awakened aspiration. Before that, where was the aspiration? Oh yeah, I had an aspiration, I wanted to know, I had read many things, I wanted to have an experience, I didn't think it was possible. It was there. But now there is a certain intensity because you've tasted something so special, so beautiful once, and then the aspiration is much more intense. You know it's possible, you know it's within your reach. Of course, it is heavily mixed with the restlessness of the emotions, with the agitation of our desires, and it's precisely why there is the clouding. The more the restlessness, the more the agitation, the more the excitement in wanting, the stronger the cloud, because the waters are disturbed, preventing this spontaneous reflection. And so the right way is to become very quiet. Even when the experience passes, remain quiet, recall the experience and gently lean back, aspire for it, draw it in, lean back to rest in it, whatever form, whatever vocabulary you use. But keep yourself as still as possible. Mother's advice is to remain as still as possible during the experience itself. Not to jump up in excitement, oh, I have got this experience, oh, how wonderful. That itself blocks it quickly. And this is the reason why the practice of stilling and remaining still is so important. Champaklalji once asked Sri Aurobindo, when the experience comes, it will come anyway. Why should I waste time in sitting down to meditate? And Sri Aurobindo explained that if you have not prepared yourself, when the experience comes, you will not be able to hold. You will not be able to receive. And so the regular practice of meditation creates a condition, conditions our nature to receive and to hold and to allow the experience to be fully imprinted. And the core of that is the stilling of our whole being and turning up in conscious aspiration. Remember the description earlier? When the instruments of the spirit are set right and purified in an entirely pure, silent, clarified, widened consciousness, then the purity, infinity, stillness of the one reflects itself like the sky in a limpid lake. And then of course the cloud and the veil returns. But through and in spite of the cloud and veil, even when we are not conscious of that, even when we do not have a present memory of that, its pressure continues. And that pressure has awakened in us a conscious aspiration, perhaps even at first an agitated struggle to get back the experience. Now I sit down every day and make effort in my concentration or meditation or whatever the practice is. And as a result, something begins to change gradually. Even if I did nothing, its influence from deep inside is there in those layers that I am not conscious of. What does that mean? My mind is turned outwards. I am busy looking at things outside me. I am not conscious that behind me, deep in my emotional nature, some part which was touched by that experience still yearns for it, aspires for it. Something waits to receive and feels a great relief when that peace settles once again. And something similar in my mind, perhaps even in the body consciousness. I am not conscious, but those parts are yearning because they've received the touch. That touch, once had, its imprint remains in us permanently, in our nature. If the imprint is strong enough to reflect in our normal surface activities, one can sense it in a person. But where it is not so strong, or the outer agitation is stronger and covers, still the imprint is there behind. We use the image of branding, a stamp which is indelible. It is imprinted in the very substance of your body, of your life force, of your mind. And there's nothing which can erase it. And that imprint continues to do its work quietly. There was a incident which an example I'm tempted to share with a name. When the mother did these plays with the students of the ashram school, she also used it as an occasion to change people, to connect them to higher things or to awaken in them deeper things. So in one of the plays, Vasantiji was asked to play the role of a Gandharva. So she was to sit on a swing which was raised, and from there she was to look down and watch this world unfolding. Curious perhaps, but not really interested, observing things passing. And that was her role. And mother described to her what she has to do, the state she has to be in. And of course, as she did that, mother gave the experience itself. And she said, after that, that state continued. And in everything she did, the whole day, night, some part of her would remain aloof, above, as if in that domain of the angelic worlds, looking down at this mortal world, detached, disinterested, but playing its part. And the experience lasted 1 full year. And then she said it faded out. And she was a little disturbed because she couldn't get it back. And she spoke to mother about it. And mother explained to her that the experience has not gone away. It has only receded behind the veil, and it is still there. So this is the description which Sri Aurobindo is giving here. Why this is necessary, he has explained elsewhere, that the different parts of our nature need to get habituated. Otherwise, as we described earlier, there can even be a reaction and a revolt, shutting down, closing against something too much, too overwhelming. And so an experience is given, and then through the veil, behind the veil, the preparation is made, habituation created, and then another experience comes, and a series of experiences build until that becomes a permanent state. If we make no effort, that process will happen over a long time. If we make effort to habituate and to create the receptive condition, it can happen rapidly. Sometimes even within days, weeks or months, and the thing becomes stabilized. If you read Sri Aurobindo's record of yoga, you can see how rapidly he progresses from level to level, because he is in a concentrated effort 24 hours to develop and establish in himself the stages of the sadhana. This passage, having read it, it will be useful to view a passage from Savitri, where there is a description of this whole process. In a divine, this is page 80, 81, 82. This is Ashwapati in his movement of liberation, where he has had an experience already of the higher consciousness as he has withdrawn from the earth domain, turning up. He mounted burning like a cone of fire. To a few is given that godlike rare release, one among many thousands never touched. So this movement is a bit like what we read earlier about the bird rising released. The full sentence begins earlier. One pointed to the immaculate delight, questing for God as for a splendid prey, he mounted, burning like a cone of fire. The description is so fascinating. Questing for God as for a splendid prey, a hunter chasing a prey. That's the kind of chase. Burning like a cone of fire, and you have this image. Arrows. The tip is what is rising. The rest of the being gently follows to whatever degree it can. To a few is given that godlike rare release, one among many thousands never touched, engrossed in the external world's design, is chosen by a secret witness eye and driven by a pointing hand of light across his soul's unmapped immensitudes. Many thousands exist in humanity who are never touched. Out of those many thousands, one is chosen by a secret witness eye, capital E. So it is the all-seeing eye which looks, and that drives by a pointing hand of light, guides the soul. And a pilgrim of the everlasting truth, our measures cannot hold his measureless mind. He has turned from the voices of the narrow realm and left the little lane of human time. And the description of how he is rising. But then, as thus it rose to meet him bare and pure, a strong descent leaped down, a might, a flame, a beauty half visible with deathless eyes, a violent ecstasy, a sweetness dire, enveloped him with its stupendous limbs and penetrated nerve and heart and brain that thrilled and fainted with the epiphany. His nature shuddered in the unknown's grasp. In a moment shorter than death, longer than time, by a power more ruthless than love, happier than heaven, taking sovereignly into eternal arms, hailed and coerced by stark absolute bliss, in a whirlwind circuit of delight and force, hurried into unimaginable depths, upborne into immeasurable heights. It was torn from its mortality. It is his being, was torn from its mortality and underwent a new and bournless change. I'm skipping lines. All that represses our fallen consciousness was taken from him like a forgotten load. A fire that seemed the body of a god consumed the limiting figures of the past and made large room for a new self to live. You see the action of the descending force creating the space, freeing up from the narrowness. Eternity's contact broke the molds of sense. A greater force than the earthly held his limbs. Huge workings bared his undiscovered sheaths. All the layers of his subtle bodies are bared out. Strange energies wrought and screened tremendous hands unwound the triple cord of mind and freed the heavenly wideness of a Godhead's gaze. So the whole thing is happening in a subtle body, in the mental consciousness, the triple cord which binds the mental consciousness is bound to the ego on three levels: the physical limiting ego, the vital limiting ego, and the mental limiting ego. All these three are unwound. As through a dress the wearer's shape is seen, they reached through forms the hidden absolute, a cosmic feeling and transcendent sight. And we read this last time. The little ego's ring could join no more in the enormous spaces of the self. The body now seemed only a wandering shell. But there's another passage where also you find this description of the imprint, the impact, which is earlier. So, in moments when the inner lamps are lit and the life's cherished guests are left outside, our spirit sits alone and speaks to its gulfs. But this is not something which happens automatically. One has to leave life's cherished guests outside and turn in. And then a wider consciousness opens then its doors. Invading from spiritual silences, a ray of the timeless glory stoops a while to commune with our seized, illumined clay and leaves its huge white stamp upon our lives. So once that contact is made, it's there imprinted. In the oblivious field of mortal mind, revealed to the closed prophet eyes of trance, or in some deep internal solitude witnessed by a strange immaterial sense, the signals of eternity appear. So there is a complete interiorization or even a state of trance, and there we see these signals of eternity. And all the variations of those signals are described. A truth mind could not know unveils its face. We hear what mortal ears have never heard. We feel what earthly sense has never felt. We love what common hearts repel and dread. Our minds, hushed to a bright omniscient, a voice calls from the chambers of the soul. We meet the ecstasy of the Godhead's touch in golden privacies of immortal fire. These signs are native to a larger self that lives within us, by ourselves unseen. Only sometimes a holier influence comes. A tide of mighty surgings bears our lives, and a diviner presence moves the soul. Or, through the earthly coverings, something breaks, a grace and beauty of spiritual light, the murmuring tongue of a celestial fire. So there is a larger self that is within us, unknown to us, unseen by us, and sometimes it surges forward, or it kind of leaks through, breaks through the earthly coverings, meaning this particularly the dullness of the physical consciousness. So in these passages also in Savitri he discusses how after the experience there is a return and as if a gradual veiling of the experience. And at that time, he explains, although to us it seems as if it is veiled, that which was touched continues to work behind and prepares the ground, changes things quietly, unseen, unknown to us. So, what works in it then? Okay. In reality, what happens is that a cloud or veil intervenes between the lower nature and the higher consciousness, and the Prakriti resumes for a time its old habit of working. For a time, it comes back. But under the pressure of that high experience, but not always with a knowledge or present memory of that high experience. What happens then? What's happening in this mechanical activity of Prakriti? What works in it then is a ghost of the old ego supporting a mechanical repetition of the old habits upon the remnants of confusion and impurity still left in the system. So we're assuming that which liberates the consciousness. Afterwards, when you come back and the experience fades, the ego returns. But you look at it and you say, what is this? It's so petty, it's so silly, it's not me. That's the sense of the ghost. No more one identifies with it. No more one cherishes and treasures it, but it's there. And it's there in the mechanical habit of your personality, and you say, oh, I still find myself getting these insecurities, getting upset, getting reactive, getting this and that, but it's not me. Even if you do not make sufficient effort, after a while, by habit, you may identify with the ego again. But the moment there's a knock, you're shaken awake and say, I made the mistake of identifying. It's not me. The break, in a sense, is permanent. But the form is not yet fully freed. But you are shocked out of it now because the identification is no more complete. You know what it's like to be separate. You know what it's like to not have this narrowness of the ego. And so very quickly, a quick shock, a blow from life, and you shake yourself awake. It's not me. But what is it that you feel yourself to be? You're not yet that. You are what earlier he has described as this fundamental ego sense. Something that's aware, feels itself narrow, and it's in between. This machinery of your outer habitual nature and habits with the ghost of the ego. This fundamental ego sense, which tends to lose itself, join with the ego or break out, or which can turn to that and yearn for it, long for it, aspire for it, concentrate on it, and so on. The cloud intervenes and disappears. The rhythm of ascent and descent renews itself until the impurity has been worked out. So, subsequently, there can be a series of experiences, awakening to something higher, losing it, returning. And so, through that ascent, when you awaken into that wideness, and then a descent, when you come back to your normal, but something of the wideness follows, and its imprint stays influencing things until the impurity has been worked out. How long? He comments on this. This period of alternations may easily be long in the integral yoga. There are other systems where that period may not be so long. It's there everywhere, in any system. But the period may be short or long depending on what it is one is seeking. If the goal was to use these occasions to get out and lose yourself, then the alternations may become shorter and shorter, may be quite short, quickly. But if the goal is to purify the whole nature and have that living experience in life, in the full consciousness, including the surface parts, then there is a much longer demand of purification, and therefore the alternations may be also much longer. That's because of the nature of the goal. This period of alternations may easily be long in the integral yoga, for there an entire perfection of the system is required. It must be capable, and this is our goal, it must be capable at all times and in all conditions and all circumstances, whether of action or inaction, of admitting and then living in the consciousness of the supreme truth. This is our goal. We must be able to admit the consciousness of the supreme truth and live in it. Again, 2 degrees. First you admit you're not yet living in it, but later you're living in it. But it's not enough that I'm doing this when I'm in a state of deep inner concentration. And the moment I come out and open my eyes, quickly it begins to fade and I fall back into my old cantankerous habitual nature. That's not acceptable. It must be, he says, it must be capable at all times and in all conditions and all circumstances. So all times meaning through day and night, 24 hours every second, in all conditions, whether interiorized, exteriorized, heightened, deepened, active, inactive, passive, speaking, working, jumping, singing, dancing, whatever it is. All conditions and all circumstances, even under extreme provocation, it should be there, solid, unshakable. That's the goal towards which we are moving. But in the beginning, this can be only held in that part which has got habituated to being still enough to be able to reflect and to be able to receive. And for that, often at first, one needs a long preparation of gathering, interiorizing, holding the state, creating the right condition. And then you get a glimpse of something, and then you come out, it fades out. You'll recall when Mother was working on realizing her soul, she said she was in continuous concentration day and night for 1 full month. And then the breakthrough took place. What does that mean, to be in continuous concentration day and night? It means whatever is happening, some part of me keeps awareness here. Deep within me is the presence, and turning inwards in aspiration, aspires, yearns, invokes, or deepens the contact in whatever way, to whatever degree, in the midst of all things. I'm going to say it's not difficult. You can do it for a few minutes. It is difficult to be able to do it longer. It's difficult to do it in a sustained way. It's not difficult to do it for short times. So the way we can put this into practice is do it for a few seconds and every few minutes, at every point of transition. Whenever you move from one point to another, transition from one activity to another, you pause, connect, feel, invoke, whatever way, make the contact. And it has to be done with persistence. You will recall earlier in the descriptions we had, constant fixing of the thought upon the idea of the one and the infinite. This, if persistently done, changes in the end the mental outlook on oneself and the whole world. The persistence here is critical. And even though we are not able to do it continuously, we are able to do it persistently in short durations. This is doable. And if you can persist in it, Mother says, normally the realization of the psychic being may take up to 30 years in a normal life. But she says here, the conditions have been created that it can be done very rapidly, even within a month. And if one were to decide on this and make the effort for this persistence of the contact and build, deepen the contact, it's possible to have a breakthrough. However brief, however partial, but a breakthrough within a month, where once that contact is made, after that all the rest becomes that much easier. And the changes begin to happen as a result of it. But at first, necessarily it will be in that part where the readiness has been created. All the rest has been made somewhat quiet, somewhat passive. And the moment those things begin to work, we lose it. And until that thing which is done internally spreads and establishes itself in the whole being, there will be alternations. Less and less, the loss less and less, the variation less and less, the frequency less and less, but still they will be there. For there an entire perfection of the system is required. It must be capable at all times and in all conditions and all circumstances, whether of action or inaction, of admitting and then living in the consciousness of the Supreme Truth. Ramana Maharshi described how he attained to the realization of the self in continuous concentration, one-pointed, in 3 days. But after that, it took him 10 years to establish that as the constant state of realization in the midst of all activities, including sleep, waking, talking, cooking, working. That took 10 years. Until then, of course, there would have been alternations. At first, what is realized deep within fades as you open your eyes, enter activity. So there are periods in which you don't want to get into activity, but gradually you go through alternations. And bit by bit you find in the midst of basic simple activities, with the consciousness deeply turned inwards, you're able to retain that state. Later, you're able to gently look outward and still retain that state. But when you speak, it breaks. When you get up, when you walk, when you run, the agitation of the life energies breaks it. Bit by bit, it creeps in, spreading its impact and influence on all these parts, bringing its stillness in all of them. And that process to perfection in all states took him 10 years. Nor is it enough for the sadhaka to have the utter realization only in the trance of samadhi or in emotionless quietude, but he must, in trance or in waking, in passive reflection or energy of action, be able to remain in the constant samadhi of the firmly founded Brahmic consciousness. So this samadhi is a state which has to be established in the full waking in all the activities. He puts a footnote here, Gita. You will find the phrase in the Bhagavad Gita, Esha Brahmi Sthiti. This Brahmic consciousness state established must be in all things in life. But if or when our conscious being has become sufficiently pure and clear, then there is a firm station in the higher consciousness. So here's the interesting thing. Some part sufficiently clear and pure, not the whole thing, but some part is sufficiently clear and pure, then in that part there is a firm station in the higher consciousness. The impersonalized jiva, one with the universal, or possessed by the transcendent, lives high above and looks down undisturbed at whatever remnants of the old working of nature may revisit the system. So something in that person remains like this, looking, observing, yes, these things happen. And again, he puts a footnote on the phrase lives seated, lives high seated above. And the footnote is the Sanskrit phrase udasina. And Sri Aurobindo comments on it, the word for the spiritual indifference. That is to say, the unattached freedom of the soul touched by the supreme knowledge. That is how he defines udasina. It looks, and these things happen, nature comes, the old habits come. He cannot be moved by the workings of the three modes of Prakriti in his lower being, nor can he be shaken from his station by the attacks even of grief and suffering. So that station remains. Here there are attacks of grief, attacks of suffering, the three modes, that is tamas, rajas and sattva, they are all doing their usual thing, but from the station one is unshaken. And finally, there being no veil between the higher, the higher peace overpowers the lower disturbance and mobility. There is a settled silence in which the soul can take sovereign possession of itself above and below and altogether. So in that initial poise which is established there, while the fluctuations take place, of course from there is a steady influence. There is a return to that poise, but eventually that takes complete possession of the whole nature, establishes its rule, a settled silence, and the soul can take sovereign possession of itself above and below and altogether. So the soul had initially possession of itself in the higher station, now also below, and the totality of our being. There is no more a gap, and therefore no more an oscillation or fluctuation in the experience. The condition is steady. So this is the brief summary of the way the thing normally proceeds in the movement of the release from the ego. All the fine variations and distinctions and natures of experience have been mapped out, and the description is led to completion. Remember, there is still one more step possible, which is the immersion in the transcendence. But broadly, this is how one reaches a state of stability in full waking consciousness, the higher and lower all united in that state of Brahmic consciousness. Now comes the fine distinction made between the approach of the integral yoga and the conventional paths, where one would have taken the method of the way of knowledge with a different object to get out of it. Such possession, where we have the full possession above and below, such possession is not indeed the aim of the traditional yoga of knowledge, whose object is rather to get away from the above and the below and all into the indefinable absolute. But whatever the aim, the path of knowledge must lead to one first result, and absolute quietude. For unless the old action of nature in us be entirely quieted, it is difficult, if not impossible, to found either any true soul status or any divine activity. Our nature acts on a basis of confusion and restless compulsion. Confusion and restless compulsion to action. The divine acts freely out of a fathomless calm. Into that abyss of tranquility we must plunge and become that if we are to annul the hold of this lower nature upon the soul. Therefore, the universalized jiva first ascends into the silence. It becomes vast, tranquil, actionless. What action takes place, whether of body and these organs or any working, whatever, the jiva sees but does not take part in, authorize, or in any way associate itself with it. There is action, but no personal actor, no bondage, no responsibility, and so on. This describes to us the importance of this foundation of stillness in particular context of the yoga of knowledge. Now remember, yoga of knowledge, yoga of works, and yoga of devotion are three starting points. The three joining together make the base for the proper yoga integral and the yoga of transformation and self-perfection. So in the yoga of knowledge, this stillness is essential. And therefore, he says, there is the first ascent into silence, and it becomes vast, tranquil, actionless. And any action are seen to be not authorized, separate, mechanical of nature. A very different process is taken up in the yoga of works, where action itself is made the means. One starts by consecrating the efforts and the results, consecrating ourselves, and so on. And you can see how these two are complementary. The yoga of love, devotion, starts by turning the heart's love to the divine. And all the passion of the heart's yearning and seeking in whatever disturbance is turned Godward. And through that, purified. And you can see how that is complementary with these two. The three together give you a framework of practice in which, while in activity, while not in activity, standing back, or while in relation to things in the world and people, on all these levels, simultaneously there can be a Godward turn. The peace that is established through the way of knowledge will serve to purify the efforts in the way of works and the way of devotion. The closeness and intimacy of love experienced through the way of devotion will amplify the contact and the presence experienced through the way of knowledge and through the way of works. Through the way of works, the closeness and intimacy felt in the activity and the purification taking place in our active energies will prepare the ground for the realization through the way of knowledge to be established in working life, in waking consciousness. And so all of these are mutually supportive of each other. Even if we took up one of them as a starting point of our practice, they would tend to broaden, to merge with the other two as we enter the higher ranges of the practice, which Sri Aurobindo describes later, how they join. But we look at the big picture now. And as there is this triple joining, our whole of our nature is prepared and purified and enters in communion with the divine. And so the whole journey becomes far more easy. Because if you took any one of these methods, whatever is opposing and contrary to that method would act as a pullback. But when you take all three, then there is nothing left which can act as a pullback. All these parts are being taken up simultaneously. Although one may predominate according to our nature, but all three parts being taken up, there is nothing left which can be really a cause for a delay or a wait. And so the whole movement of the being can rise much more easily and joyously. So this description which follows subsequently, what happens and in what way the consciousness watches from the poise of silence, and from that poise how it turns to the transcendent, is the further passage of this paragraph, which we will take up next Friday. For now, we can pause here and take up any questions or comments. So the restless confusion and obscuring impurity of our outward nature, these are the things which compel the loss of the experience or the partiality of the experience and temporariness. And these are the things which we work at first to establish. And that's why in the practice of the integral yoga, the first foundation, the first base is purification. And then the 6 limbs of the yoga are built up on that. And the purification includes both of these: removal of the restlessness and separating of the threads of consciousness and their confusion. Regular practice, time spent in that poise of stillness, consciously observing, clarifying, separating the mixtures of the various impulses in our nature. All of this has been described before and must continue until the full base of purity is established. But as some part of us enters in contact of the deeper experience, its influence massively amplifies this effort. And so what would normally have taken in the purification and removal of confusion many years, perhaps even decades of effort, can be achieved rapidly by the active action of the experience, and especially of the divine Shakti, the divine grace, the divine force, the divine mother's action in us. And then sometimes it can be done often within a few years, or in some cases even within a few months. The mother created the ashram for this purpose, where an effort of this kind one could dedicate to without having to worry about survival, earning your living, roof over your head, and so on. She had said, soon after the ashram was established, she said from her childhood she dreamt of a possibility to have a space like this, where all the basic external necessities would be taken care of, so that you could dedicate yourself exclusively to a one-pointed effort of this kind. And then she said, when the opportunity came, I created the ashram for this reason. And it's something we tend to forget. We tend to lose ourselves in the routine even of our life. But in a similar way, one does not have to be necessarily physically here. In the life that we are at, wherever we may be in the world, one can create a similar circumstance, an ashram-like atmosphere, even where we are, even in the midst of the work and the insecurities of normal life. One can simplify our life sufficiently that we are not obsessed by them and always in a precarious balance. We're sufficiently stable that we can put ourselves in a one pointed concentration. And so, this should be our effort if we are to take full advantage of the opportunity given to us. We'll continue this next Friday.